Okay, everybody, welcome back. And in this session before lunch, we're going to go through the conclusions from the different breakout sessions. And this is the time to have a good discussion around the points that have been raised. Looking at the text on this slide, you could summarize the challenges, I think, as partly cultural, so raising awareness, having some way of appreciating or adding a value to peer review activity, and then technical challenges. So, I mean, the first one on this list is that not all preprint reviews have DOIs. If they all had DOIs, then anyone who chooses to put their reviews on their CV or on ORCID would be able to do that. So if we start off with the first challenge, which would be the cultural challenge and the lack of awareness of researchers that they can include their reviews in their CVs. Are there any ways in which we could intervene to help with that you would like to suggest? Nope.
Just say that they can be included as scholarly outputs in the instructions.
Yes, and I think actually there's a lot to be said for when we're talking to training young researchers, talking about it, just flagging this up as a useful thing to do. And I think for me personally, I find that my postdocs are keen to be involved in peer review, but their opportunities are normally when I say I'm going to referee this paper and I'd like you to contribute, or when they get more senior to give their names. But I thought what was really interesting this morning was that you can obviously review a preprint on your own, and on some platforms you can have a DOI for that. So I think we just need to make people aware of that. Sorry, Gautam.
Yeah, I mean, I think Katie, it was actually Katie's point in our discussion group. I think she's upstairs flipping her flies. So I will just try to summarize what she said. I mean, in this bottom-up context, she made the point that there are also fairly large forums like Future PI Slack, for example, which is postdocs on the job market around the world. It would not be, because these forums provide templated documents and so on to their members, for applications. It would not be so hard to get a templated CV that includes reviewing activity out to a really large number of people. And so you don't have to wait for the institution to change it if all the postdocs applying for a job already have it in their CV.
Yeah, I think that's is a good point. And another point would be that if you're talking, for example, you could ask the question about what are your contributions to open science, for example, and there could be a number of different ways in which you could show that, and you could guide somebody about the types of opportunities. Sorry, Bodo.
And I think it's also important in those guidelines to emphasize that we want to see the actual reviews. We don't want to hear what journals you've reviewed for. That's the same DORA-like problem that we are trying to overcome. It's the actual review, the scholarly contribution that matters on the CV, not the prestige name that is associated with who you've worked for.
Yeah. So taking that into conventional journal publishing, that would mean that somebody who had reviewed a paper where their reviews were published alongside the article, they would just have to remember that they had reviewed that paper and provide the link. They'd say, I was mystery referee 3 or whatever.
Well, actually, yeah, that's a good follow-up on that. But on the intervention side then, do you envision that CVs and the review criteria would include a list of DOIs associated with those reviews? There's a sort of a technical challenge in providing the reviews themselves, particularly when those are anonymous. And so is your expectation then that the intervention is just completely de-anonymized, or that people would curate the reviews themselves that they want to disclose?
There could be I mean, it is a challenge, and obviously it's easiest if you have signed it, if you have posted your peer review with a preprint, so then that's no problem whatsoever. But I think there are also ways that you can add a peer review to ORCID, and it's only visible to trusted organizations, and you could identify those trusted organizations. They can see all the actual reviews, but the public cannot. I mean, that's just, I mean, I'm not sure whether that's a solution for everything, but it's one solution of keeping anonymity, but not completely.
Do we have anybody here from PubPeer?
I don't think so, unless there's someone watching online.
Because I think PubPeer originally was the concept of a sort of online journal club, and you could certainly, you know, if you're active on PubPeer, you could put that on your CV. There are a number of different ways in which you could point to what you've been up to in that area. Although, of course, that's commenting post publication rather than pre.
A reminder to please state your name when you speak as well. Yeah.
Yes. And for people who are online, Jessica is monitoring you to see if you have any questions or would like to intervene. So we've talked about the need to raise awareness amongst researchers that their contributions here are valuable and ways of capturing them that are not too painful. I mean, certainly having reviewed a lot of job applications, the last thing I would want to see is an application which had everybody's peer review that they conducted. It would be too much. But I think there are easy ways to signpost to that. And then how about the need for funders to recognise peer review as an output? And we flagged the difficulty of understanding how this ranks relative to other contributions. And of course, early career researchers who are good at peer review can hope that in time they may be invited to join an editorial board, or if they're good at providing grant reviews, they might be invited to join a panel. But that is really seeing the benefit as a means to an end. So does anyone have any thoughts on how we could signal or how funders could weight contributions in peer review compared to other contributions?
Just make it a scoreable criteria.
So now this sounds very anti-Dora, that we're not going to cite your impact factor, but we're going to score your reviewing performance.
Well, it doesn't have to be just a quantity, right? So I don't know. The NIH criterion scores, right? You could have one that is, open science contributions or what have you, reviewing contributions, et cetera, or make it a part of the investigator score, the guidelines for the investigator score, for example, or the innovation score.
Yeah, it was something that we didn't discuss in my breakout group, but I think in many countries, researchers are quite comfortable now making a statement about their approach to mentorship, promoting diversity. And so if we put this in as open science is important and this is a way in which you can contribute, then I think that would... But I would probably bucket it as a different sort of activity to diversity and inclusion, obviously. Sorry, Tom.
Maybe one idea for those who are using narrative CVs is to actually let to the reviewers or to the scientists decide themselves what weight they want to put and how much they want to highlight the reviewing activity in the narrative CV.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering if, in some ways, we're tackling this almost the wrong way around. We're trying to give credit for reviews in a system which is culturally not yet used to making review reports public. So we actually don't know, or I mean, we all individually know the value when we see a good review report, but it's not exposed to show others what that report is. And instead of listing, I mean, the onus is now on the reviewers to list how many reviews they've done and put it in a CV. But actually, if we just make anyone applying for a job, they have to list their papers and the public review reports, the review reports of those papers. It's an indirect way to raise the importance of reviewing. But again, put it on that, and that will enable anonymity of the reviewer, but raise the value of reviewer reports so that you can only be included in a panel or assessed for faculty or whatever if you've got the transparent review reports alongside every article you include in your CV. And that itself, I think, will push the system to seeing the value of peer review. And that would rely on pushing transparent peer review full stop, regardless of whether it's preprints or articles. And just in the same way that it took funders to really make that push towards open access and mandate open access publications in your CV. Funders, if they mandated open access publications alongside the public review reports, and every journal had to produce transparent peer reports, it doesn't matter about anonymity, that just raises the importance and the value of peer review across the entire system and allows everyone to see the variation, the massive variation and quality in peer review reports, in peer review itself, rather than trying to push it from the other way.
Yeah, good point.
Just want to highlight that Denis has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, just to say I fully agree with this, and this is what we try to do with PCI. That what we wanted to do is to make public review, so authors and reviewers can just give the link to the recommendation on PCI where there's their review and they can put this on their CV. Yeah. So it's not only a question of number of reviews that you can do; it's the quality of the review. So you can make many reviews, but single line saying it's a good review. But if the committee members in committees can see the quality of your review, so that would be great. So I definitely agree with the fact that if we want reviews to be more done by reviewers, by scientists, we need transparency of the reviews, definitely.
Yep, thank you. Okay. If we shift now onto the more technical challenges, I think the comments on technical support for this process is interesting. And I was curious at point 2, user experience of preprint surveys makes it difficult to see reviews when they do exist. Is this a dig at bioRxiv and the little tiny green tick, or is there something richer behind that?
Well, if it's James Fraser, UCSF again, if Richard's on, he probably knows because I CC him on emails about this all the time. But I think the little discovery bar is really, really hard for a lot of people to recognize. The distinctions between the different things are subtle. And then right now there are comments that are directly, one click away from the full text being away. There are other comments that link you out to a separate website, etc. And I both always agree with Richard's reasoning in the moment and then disagree with the long-term plan, respectfully to my friend Richard. And I would like to see sort of bolder action from bioRxiv to elevate those reviews, make them more visible, make the full text sort of, visible alongside and make it less confusing from a UI, UX perspective.
So Jamie's emboldened by the fact that you're in the virtual world, Richard, but you should...
Oh, no, I'd be even worse if he were here. Even worse.
So over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's, and I'm sure John would want to leap in here because it's something that we discuss an awful lot. I think there's a balance to strike here, and we are in the process of trying to increase the visibility of those comments. There, on the second point about offsite comments, there's a balance to strike. I mean, you might think slightly differently if you worked on COVID-19 vaccines as to how clear you want all the commenting on your paper to be displayed. It is moderated, but it is, it is an issue. And I go back to the point I made yesterday that there are people who are wary of this as authors. An anecdote here: I was talking to a famous biologist a couple of years ago who had put their paper on archive despite being a big supporter of bioRxiv. And I said, well, why did you put the paper on archive, not bioRxiv? I mean, and the response was because archive doesn't have comments. So I think, with 10% of papers having comments at this point, 10% of papers being on bioRxiv and preprint servers, we need to keep that in mind. But I think there's a much more important point here, which is actually about discovery, which makes that a little bit irrelevant. The vast majority of attention to bioRxiv preprints comes in the days after they are posted on bioRxiv. It's just like journals, but it's even more extreme. You get this big peak and then it trails off. So the real point is that by the time a review arrives on bioRxiv, very few people are looking at that paper. Most people have already looked at it and they're going to go back. So that is the thing that we need to focus on to alert people to the existence of comments and reviews around bioRxiv. So we have the follow option, we have various alerts. And I think, I've had this conversation with Toma at EMBO, and saying, we want the EMBO reviews or the review commons reviews to be much clearer on bioRxiv so that people see them. And I said to him, the best thing you can possibly do to get people to look at review commons posts on bioRxiv is put them in the EMBO journal table of contents.
Exactly.
So I think that's the thing that we should really focus. I mean, we will definitely address the point. I mean, I think Jamie makes some very good points. We're in the process of doing that, but I don't think that's going to solve the problem. The real problem is alerting people to the fact that these things have arrived after the fact, when they've already looked at the paper or it's had its moment in the news.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to bring John in and then Thea.
Thank you, Fiona. Apologies for my voice. Everything Richard said is, of course, entirely true. This is a matter of much discussion in-house. I think what we are trying to do here is, I take Jamie's point, I take Jamie's point entirely, that when there are reviews, they are not very easily discoverable. And I think we have to do a better job of improving that UX, and we are talking about that and thinking about it. We also want to keep the distinction that's been made many times in the course of the last 2 days, to try the distinctions between different kinds of evaluation and assessment, which was part of the concept for the much maligned launch bar that Jamie referred to. That was an attempt to give information about the fact that there are different kinds of evaluations, and we also provided some kind of quantitation of that. But I think it is too subtle. I think we are definitely going to make some changes. We're not entirely sure what those changes will be yet, but I think the overarching goal is to ensure that when you do go back to a preprint, then you can see what the reactions to it have been easily and quickly get to those different kinds of evaluations wherever they may be. So look, that's one takeaway for me from this meeting. And Richard and I were chatting about that yesterday. So thanks for pointing that out.
Good. Thanks, John. So Thea and then Brandon online.
Hi, Theo Bloom, BMJ and medRxiv. And since Jamie's introduced us to let's all get our favourite bugbear out, mine is that if we want preprint reviews to be treated as first-class objects, they have to not be seen as secondary to the preprint and bunged on the preprint server, not seen as secondary to the journal article and put, as we do at BMJ, as a supplementary file to the journal article. They need their own place that validates that this is a review, that provides all the metadata that you need to link it to the preprint and what have you, and that we shouldn't actually be expecting preprint servers to be the place that alert you and tell you and what have you. There should be some kind of proper recognition of these reviews. And the group that I was in were talking precisely about the need for a schema, metadata, standards for preprint reviews if we want them to be taken seriously. And I would argue part of that is also about a place as well as a structure for them.
Thanks, Thea. I'll bring Brandon in now.
Hi, Brandon Stahl from PubPeer. Just one point about the discovery of commentary after days after it's been published. One thing that we've done at PubPeer is to create plugins for like Zotero and citation managers, which could be useful for bioRxiv for people to find commentary after the preprint has been published. In the citation manager, when people go to cite that preprint, they can see that there is a comment left days or months before they in the past. Just a suggestion for bioRxiv in discovery. If there was a bioRxiv plugin for citation managers, that might help in discovery of the commentary.
It's a good point. Did John or Richard want to come back on that?
I mean, that sounds. I mean, I think in general, plugins are a good thing, and to bear in mind, in some respects, the entire comment system of bioRxiv and Trip, etc., is managed by somewhat of a plugin. If we think of hypothesis like that, so yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Thanks, Brendan.
Hi, Gabe Stein, Knowledge Features. I just want to react to some of this by saying we can, plugin solutions are good, metadata is really important, better UX is really important, but at the end of the day, all of the attention, as Richard pointed out, is aggregated on the preprint servers in the days immediately following when it gets posted. So if we want people to participate in preprint review, it has to start there. If we want them to know that preprint review exists, it has to start there. That's where all the attention is currently aggregated. And so I love the idea of plugins and things that happen after the fact and all of that. But bottom line, until we make it easier for people to understand that they can do this and that these artifacts exist in the place where people go, until we come to them where they are already, where audiences are already going on bioRxiv, on medRxiv, which is way better than other preprint servers, by the way. Until we do that, I don't think we're going to see many changes. And so I think part of the point of our group writing about the user experience is not a knock at bioRxiv or medRxiv or any archives or anyone. It's just saying you all are where all the attention is aggregated. And so that's where we need to put our focus right now as a community until we can build, as other folks were suggesting, other places that people know where to go. But that has to be the starting point.
Good, thank you. Brandon, you coming back in? No.
Sorry, no, I just forgot to put my hand down.
Okay, I would like to move the... Oh, sorry, Elliot.
Yeah, Elliot Peroff. I mean, first point, but not my main point. bioRxiv is actually the best one for showing reviews, so I'm actually quite thankful to bioRxiv. It's easier than OSF. Archive doesn't have anything, etc., etc. I think when we were thinking about discoverability preprints, the kind of central point was like DOIs. right? And so how these are being, how that works, right? And we kind of want to we don't have like a standard for that now. I think Crossref have just started doing something with it, but each of like us as review services are not aligned. And I think if anything could potentially come out of it, it might just be us getting together and just aligning, basically. I think eLife might already be getting somewhere with it. So yeah, just like agree.
Thank you. I wanted to actually follow on from that because I know that when you post on bioRxiv, you get a DOI. And when that work is published in a journal, it's signposted from bioRxiv so that you can find out where it landed. But Damien, I'm really curious how you see the journey of a paper submitted to eLife, where essentially it is there's no transition from preprint to, well, you go to the version of record. So how does that work practically in terms of the DOIs?
So what we wanted to do was try to make the reviewed preprint a bit more of a sort of formal object, really, that that rather than just being a preprint with reviews, it would be a sort of separate state. And, at that point, that's why we wanted to display it on the website. The point of the point of us displaying it rather than just doing it all on bioRxiv was that it allowed us to make the assessment in particular as sort of front and center. So as soon as you read the abstract, you then see the assessment as it sort of becomes part of the object that you're assessing. So you see what the paper's about, and then you see what sort of external people think of it. So it's it was deliberately aimed at trying to get that notion of the reviewed preprint as a sort of distinctly separate state to one that to a preprint that has had reviews. And I think perhaps I've slightly lost the thread of the discussion in terms of over the last 2 days, really, in terms of how much we have agreed upon that. Do we all agree that there is some kind of state change that happens, when a paper becomes reviewed, and what are the criteria by which, that allow that to happen? It seems like there is a kind of agreement that we there needs to be a certain number of reviews, and that they need to have some kind of coordination. It's not clear to me whether it needs to have an editor, or it's not clear to me whether it needs to have some kind of arbitrator, or sort of someone to make that some kind of bringing all these reviews together. Sorry, this is a very long-winded answer. But I guess that's the bit that I'm not clear about. So we felt we were just going to have a go at it ourselves, and I appreciate that is creating potentially other problems in terms of splitting versions that I know Rich and John have expressed concern over, in that we are then displaying a preprint on our site with our reviews, and what happens to other reviews, for example. So that is interesting. But I think the reason we wanted to do that was to make quite clear that there is this distinction between what we consider a reviewed preprint and what might just be a kind of preprint with some.
But I'm specifically interested at the transition from an eLife paper with the reviews to the point where the author says, this is published, this is the version of record. So from the eLife perspective, is that a transition or not?
I mean, it is for now. I think, as Mike said yesterday, ultimately we would hope that it wouldn't be in the future. That ultimately the version of record wouldn't become a useful marker of anything. But for now it is, because it's the point at which we send it for indexing in PubMed, for example. And it's the point at which the author can say that they're finished. But we don't, it doesn't necessarily have to be a part of the system. I should also say, contrary to what Mike said yesterday, there is actually an awful lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of us creating a version of record. That's when we do a lot of all our production work, all our data checks, all the sort of things that we do to sort of make it a formal version of record. So it's actually a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes to create the version of record. But we're trying to minimize that, and over time we'll move those things upstream so that they become part of the sort of preprint workflow.
Thanks, Damien. Martin Rittman from Crossref.
Hi there. So I think one of we talked a little bit about DOIs and registering reviews, and maybe just to continue on the last point, I think having a DOI for preprint and having a DOI for a journal article doesn't convey anything about the kind of the quality of that output. And I think something we would like to encourage and move towards is saying more about the properties of an item. So, you can have things that are labeled as a journal article in our database, which have not been peer reviewed. And you can have things that are labeled as a preprint and that have been peer reviewed, and being able to distinguish those by the metadata properties and the relationships that it has, hopefully, to open peer reviews, I think is something that we would like to encourage from the Crossref side.
Thanks. Richard, your hand's up again.
Yeah, I mean, just following on from what Damien said, I wanted to give, and John, correct me if you see this different, but the sort of bioarchive point of view on this. So I think it's really important what eLife are doing, and that I think in some respects the way they're doing that right now is important because the community needs to understand that this is a change in how things are being done. I think my view for going forward, what things should look like, is slightly different. On this issue of state change that you brought up, Fiona, I think there absolutely is a state change between something that is a preprint and a version of record, because of this notion that you're drawing a line under it and you're saying it's done. I can understand that's a state change, and I think that makes sense to have a different DOI, a constellation of reviews, etc. I think where I would query Damien for like what the ideal is going forward in the sort of mid to long term is I'm uncomfortable with the notion that merely putting reviews on something is itself a state change, mainly because one of the things that we're looking at is as part of this decoupling is a divergence of reviews, multiple parallel reviews, lots of things. And if you suddenly have a system where a preprint goes up and then 50 different people do some form of independent review on it, all of them claim that that's a state change, meant 50 new DOIs, then I think that becomes problematic. And, Martin may want to speak to this, but we did talk about this in a while ago with Crossref and various others about this issue of sort of constellations of review activities. And at some point, a state change as this became a version of record, but those review activities, because they will be, we want them to be kind of wild and varied and incremental, that they themselves would not create a state change. So I guess that's where I'm a little uncomfortable with the notion that review itself creates a state change, because I suspect if we say that review itself creates a state change, then we will have a 200-year discussion about what constitutes review, what is sufficient to warrant this, and I don't think that will ever be resolved satisfactorily.
Well, and presumably once the author has decided it's the version of record, the discussion carries on PubPeer. So, yes, and you can have discussion going on for years.
So can I come back just
yes.
quickly? I agree. We published something in F1000 about the idea of having there is a state change and there is a change in state or a change in standing, and a paper can have no change. So the point is about our review preprints is we're not touching the XML. We use your XML. So basically, it is the content is unchanged, but all that's happening is that the discussion around it is kind of allows for a new context, and so it's perhaps the standing that is changing in that world, and then the state change comes with a version record. I mean, it's a sort of subtle difference, but I think it's perhaps right.
Thanks. Before I bring in Dennis, I've got Jessica.
Yeah, hi, Jessica from AZAP. Just a note that in the final session, we'll have a presentation of a draft citation format from the Funder and Institution Working Group, which I think touches on this issue of how these things are bundled together. So there's plenty of time to have more of that conversation later.
Great, thanks. So Dennis and then Martin.
No, it's exactly on the same discussion. I was interested by the answer of Richard about if we remove the version of records, because at PCI we do make a stage change by, the recommendation, when we publish recommendation, it makes us change stage. But because we are not a version of record, we are still considered that as not being, formally published like in a journal. So I was interested by your answer to Damien's suggestions to remove the version of record. But I do see a change, a stage change when there is an endorsement, even if there is not a version of record.
Okay. And Martin?
Yeah, I guess maybe implicit in some of the comments is the idea that when there's a change in state or maybe a change in standing, there's a change in the DOI as well. What we recommend from the Crossref side is that you register a new DOI when there's a change in how something would be cited. I think maybe just to kind of repeat a little bit what I said before. We need to ask ourselves the questions of how do we communicate the properties of something and the ongoing evaluation and the context that's around a piece of work. As Richard was saying, if there's a kind of continuous evaluation of something, you don't want to have a new DOI or have some large UI change when you get one extra comment. But just changing the DOI is not necessarily the only way to indicate that.
Thanks, Martin. Dario, and then Tama.
Yeah, Dario Tarbarelli from CZI. I think a very practical question that is related but kind of orthogonal to the issue of at what point there's a version of record, at what point there's a new version of a DOI or the separate DOIs, is this question that it really matters for the authors of aggregating citation counts across all these objects. And I feel like, much as we're all like big fans of citation counts in the open science community, being able to prove that a preprint and a preprint with reviews has a citation advantage and accumulates citations earlier on. So that's going to be a very important driver for more people to do this. Is something right now is very, very hard because we don't have mechanisms of aggregating across these objects, including traditional journal articles that publish a preprint. There's no good mechanism for us as a community. There's no norm that allows us to compress and aggregate all the citations. I think that's a very important question that this community maybe can help address.
That's a good point. Thomas?
Okay, I just want to make the point that I'm slightly worried about the conflation of technical terms, a state change, whatever it is. I think it's totally undefined what a state change, even what a state really is. It looks like a state change is something that is on the implementation and maybe a new identifier. I think we should try to avoid new identifiers and the proliferation of that if possible. The conflation with these technical aspects and the more policy aspect, we actually want to have reviewed preprint being actionable and be linked to a difference. We want to reward these things. So maybe it's not a technical state change, but I think it should be really an actionable state change that we do something with a review preprint, whether it has a new DOI and has a branding associated with it or not. If it's just a bunch of cross-ref relationships that link a preprint to reviews, maybe that's not a technical state change, but I think we should be really careful that this can be recognized and that we don't expect now having a recommendation or having continuous decisions with an editorial blurb as the only thing that can be rewarded. So I'm a bit worried about the conflation of technical considerations that are important, but also the policy and how we recognize reviewed preprint in academic credit.
I mean, Bodo made the shocking assertion that a paper doesn't actually change at all between when it's a preprint and when it's finally published in Nature. But that's for another meeting. Could we have a catch box over here?
Thank you. Yes, I was just going to sort of support the idea that really we need to move away from a version of record. And so on F1000, we don't really have a version of record per se. I mean, we have records of versions to some extent, but so we don't change the DOI unless they do a new version. And reviewer reports come in and they are linked with their own independent DOIs. But the point that actually after you've now got this version of record, this, the ensuing discussion, which should continue, now ends up having to be on another site somewhere. I think that's unhelpful. And actually, I think it all needs to be, just like research is living, the discussion around research should be living and evolves. And as we know, we often don't necessarily know, correctly whether something is important or isn't, or the impact it may have, or we may spot issues with it much further down the line. And to have this arbitrary cut-off, I think is unhelpful. And I would encourage that we try to think how we move away from that. We might want some threshold in terms of it now, and this is past this sort of, level of approval in some way. But things can go up and things can go down. I think creating a system where that is enabled would be valuable.
I think those are good points, but in practical terms, if you have a PhD student who has, submitted their paper, had it reviewed at some point, it's kind of complete for that person or that team, and then the work takes on a further life as other people, other labs, hopefully build on that work or refute it, or it's incorporated into a review of the field. So I just think that we have to accept that for the people who did the work, at some point it's finished, it's done, and it doesn't matter how much more comment there is because they may not really care. It sort of becomes important for science as a whole. So it doesn't need to be conventional journal publication, but it does have to end for the scientists concerned. I've never met any scientist who wanted it, the sort of never-ending preprint or whatever. It's just, at least not, in sort of experimental cell biology, which I'm working.
Fiona? But if there's something important that needs to change in a paper, you would still want to do it 2 years later. Of course, nobody wants.
You wouldn't care.
What? Why? Really? Oh,
because you've got your PhD, you've got your high-paid job in the Bay Area in biotech, and so who cares?
This is Jessica from ASAP. I think destigmatizing corrections on papers could help people fix the literature.
Of course,
right? And so I think that rather than going through
from
this
it being an
rigmarole,
never-ending paper. Oh, sorry, over here first.
Fiona, just to build up on what you just said, in our institution, our scientific misconduct guidelines clearly state that failure to fix a record is a form of scientific misconduct. So all our scientists are expected to deal with errors. If anyone points to a mistake in the paper, even if it's 10 or 20 years old, then if you ignore it, you're committing scientific misconduct. That's at least our policy.
Well, I can speak for my colleagues in EMBO Press, where a lot of the emphasis is in preventing retractions because mistakes are spotted early, they're corrected. And there's a difference between, an interpretation which turns out to be inadequate 5 years later and actually something which is fraudulent or something that is technically wrong. And I don't think that your misconduct committee would hold a scientist up for an interpretation which turns out to be flawed.
No, but we do hold them for not reacting and ignoring the comments. So let's say somebody comments on PubPeer about anyone's paper, even if it's 10-year-old, and they ignore it. That's misconduct in itself, the failure to react. And I think many institutions should have that, in my opinion. I don't want to have a debate on this, but just to say that's sort of, you just said that who cares if somebody points to an error 2 years later, but I think
But if I can come back to you on PubPeer, often an author doesn't know that there's adverse commenting on PubPeer.
They get an email from Einstein.
Anyway, sorry, Damien.
It's worth making a distinction between error, as you said, Fiona, that there are errors that need correcting and which should happen, and then if someone 5 years later says there's a control missing, for example, then that's probably this isn't clear cut. I think we're all probably in agreement that if people have done something wrong, then you should correct it. But it's different from, and I completely, having spoken to thousands of authors, no one has ever said that they want the kind of a living paper. This idea that saying that you're constantly sort of updating for the rest of your career is definitely not something that people want.
Okay, we have 8 minutes left, and there are some interesting points on that have come up from the breakout discussion. Could we maybe put the slide up again and just see if there are any points, open it up to everyone who feels there's something they would like to say from the breakout sessions that we haven't covered. So there are any threads that we would like to pursue or that you feel have been ignored?
Hi, Sam Hindle from Pre-Review. It's something that came up a little bit earlier, but it comes back to this discoverability aspect in that a lot of the solutions that we're thinking about are going to help us discover signed reviews. And a lot of particularly early career researchers and early career researchers from marginalized communities might not want to sign their reviews. So how can we help them to make sure that they can get the credit for the reviews that they're doing? And how can we ensure also that other people are not claiming their work as their own because they're not signed? That kind of becomes a vulnerability. Something that we've been thinking about at Pre-Review really from the outset is that how we can protect those individuals in terms of allowing them to do the reviewing work but not have the retaliation that could come from doing the review. So when you sign up to Pre-Review, we automatically give you 2 profiles. So one is a signed profile, and the other is a pseudonym, and those are linked to each other, so we know who you are. And so what we've been trying to think about is how we can allow the user to share their kind of private, like pseudonym profile, as well as their public profile, so that they can provide that to institutions who might be hiring, to granting agencies when they're applying for a grant. And so I think that's something that we need to think about and work together to resolve.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Does anyone want to amplify that? No? Did I see a hand up on the screen? Yeah, Richard, did you want to come in with a comment?
Yeah, this is sort of somewhat related to the point that Sam just made. So we had quite a long discussion in our breakout session about identity verification and how important this is. And I think the important thing is that we need to think about identity verification before we embark on this, because it's a huge and increasingly big problem in the publishing community of reviewers because of gaming. And because of fraud, and it's only going to get worse with paper mills, fake reviewers, etc. And there will be proposed solutions to identity verification which risk all the things that Sam is worried about. And so we need to kind of think of ways in which we can establish identity without compromising and revealing the individual. So it's a challenge. We're not going to solve it in like 10 minutes of conversation here, but I think it's a very important thing to be aware of. And I think in our discussion, I don't know if Salmia wants to jump in or anyone else. It was felt to be very important.
Yeah, Katrina's going to come in on that.
I think there are possibly technical solutions to this in much the same way that the OA switchboard is transmitting confidential messages between publishers and institutes about price transactions and availability. And I think if we've got the right metadata in place, there could be workflows where you could essentially create verification methods behind the scenes and have independent checks. So is this reviewer really at your institution? These sorts of types of messages. I think there is a technological solution. I don't think we're there yet. And I completely agree. It's a huge problem. And often what we're talking about here and in this room is excluding all the bad actors in the system. And unfortunately, we can't.
Thank you. And Sam's going to come back.
Just one other point, Sam, again from Pre-Review. I just want to make sure that we're also very open and transparent about how we're going to be doing this, because to make sure that the reviewers who are going to be trusting us with their information, to make sure that we're very transparent about how we're going to be sharing that, and so that they agree and opt in to that being shared.
Great, thank you. And Jessica's got... It's got Brandon.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, so these technical solutions, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different when the reviews are public. It's not totally the same as in journal peer review, because even the most innocuous reviews at PubPeer, we often receive legal letters from authors asking us to take down these reviews. Any criticism of any article will receive a legal letter, and if we have if we have a technical solution where we've linked the person's identity to a pseudonym, then we have that information and we are obliged to give it to a court. Whereas if we don't have that information, then we can't give it to a court. So the technical solutions are interesting until you start receiving the legal complaints from authors who are not happy with, even innocuous comments, what we think are innocuous comments on an article.
That's a very good point. Thank you very much, Brandon. Right, well, Naomi.
Hi, Naomi, Invest in Open Infrastructure. I think this conversation is really critical, and as Richard said, we can't do it in 10 minutes, but I think we really need a conversation about information governance and who is owning that data and who is trusted to be the people who know what's behind the scenes and what that data is potentially being used for. There's other people in the scientific publishing space who are using data for different purposes. And this topic is not unique to scientific publishing either. And there's people out there who are having these conversations about information governance in digital infrastructure. And I think it'd be really a good idea to start having these conversations about this very human problem that we're facing.
Yeah. Well, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. I would like to close the session by thanking everybody. It's been absolutely great. We're having a lunch break, and then you must be back at 1:00 sharp for the next session. So thank you very much.